In this episode, we're going to be looking at how to choose reps and sets for a given exercise. And we're also going to be talking about the frequency of those exercises or frequency of workouts. It's one of the most common questions that I get asked. I will put up videos about exercises, and one of the most common questions is, what reps should I choose? What sets should I choose? How many times should I do this per week? And there's no set answer, hence why I don't put it in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss that and look at some of the nuances and the context as to why we would choose certain reps over other reps. How we go about choosing reps, sets, and then the frequency of how often we do them, it depends on different things. And it depends on two things, essentially. It depends on the individual and it depends on the goal, if you will. So there's like an internal part to it, which is the individual, and then there's an external part, which is the goal. So we're going to choose a few different, let's just say, goals. We're going to keep them as general as we can. So we're going to start with strength training. Then we're going to look at endurance training. Then we'll talk about sort of stability training, which will sort of include rehabilitation. So these aren't definite goals. They are still quite general, but hopefully you should be able to gain an idea about which ones are most suitable. Because again, I'm working with people every day, choosing reps, sets, and trying to understand how many times they should be doing them. So there's a little bit more that goes into it than I'm going to explain here. But the goal for this episode is to give you a general direction and the types of things you need to think about with regards to why you're choosing certain reps and sets. So as I mentioned, we'll start with strength training. Well, first of all, we have to understand what strength training is. If we look at it or understand it in its purest sense, it's lifting heavy weights, let's just say 1 to 6 times. That would be described as strength training. So with regards to repetitions and strength training, as a general rule, you would only really go as high as 6. And how those reps should feel would be, you could perform 6 with the proper technique of the exercise and possibly a 7th. So you end that 6th rep and then you probably think to yourself, yeah, I could probably do one more. It would be very difficult, but I could probably do it. That's when you then know you're in the right sort of arena of the weight you need to be choosing for those 6 reps. So if the goal is to build strength, then we aim at 6 reps. Now, you can go as low, if you're doing sort of 1 rep max, or if you're in a competition, it's 1 rep. As a general rule, you don't normally train at 1 rep. You may go down as far as 3 or 4, but as a general rule, it will be from, let's just say, 3 to 6. Now, sets are kind of like the inverse of the reps. So if we take 6 reps, you might do 3 or 4 sets with that. Obviously, you would have long rest breaks in between, or longer rest breaks in between, of say, 3 to 5 minutes, something like that. And then you would perform the next set. So with 6 reps, it would be, say, 3 or 4 sets. If you come down to 5 reps, so there's a style of training called 5x5. So that is 5 reps for 5 sets. So that is another possibility. Then if you go down to 4, you could do 4 sets, 5 sets, 6 sets. So again, you can sort of see the pattern that's going on here. And again, as the reps come down, as a general rule, the weight would go up. It wouldn't go up by much depending on the body part. If it was upper body, it wouldn't each increment that you would go up for the upper body would be smaller than for the lower body. So if you're going to put an increase, if we used it using a barbell, generally the smallest weight is 1.25, and you would put that on either side. So it's a 2.5 kilo increase on as a total. So for the upper body, you would aim at 1.25 as an increase. For the lower body, you might go 2.5 as an example. So you can, again, start to see with regards to, if the goal is strength training, you would be, say, 3 to 6, 4 to 6 reps. And again, you can go anywhere from 3 to 6 sets. But if you're doing 6 reps, you generally choose 3 or 4 sets. If you're doing, say, 3 to 4 reps, you might do 5 to 6 sets. So you can sort of see that crossover. And obviously you've got then 5x5, which sort of sits in the middle. So that's strength training with regards to the goal. Now, the individual may be different, because the individual may be a beginner. So they may start somewhere else. So they may have to do, because they don't have the conditioning to be able to lift such heavy weights for half an hour, for an hour session, they may have to start with lighter weights, higher reps to build that condition and then build into strength training. So with regards to the individual, there isn't a lot of the individual that comes into it. When it's strength training, but you need to be ready for it. So that's the individual part. It's not necessarily there's individual parts that are determining the strength training. It's more the individual needs to be ready for it. So you need to build through other reps and sets through it. You obviously need ranges of movement as well, to be able to get into the positions you need to get into. There's no point in doing heavy deadlifts, so strength training style deadlifts, if you haven't got the range of movement at the hips and the back's all bent out of shape. The muscles aren't working properly in the hips, because then you're going to cause yourself problems. So if it's strength training, to summarize, up to 6 reps, as many as 3 to 4 sets, but that works on the inverse. If you go down to 3 to 4 reps, you may do 5 to 6 sets. And then in the middle, you kind of got 5x5 training, which you can look up. And then with the individual, it's very much, you need to be ready for that type of training. So yes, that's strength training. Oh, and with regards to how often you would perform that, again, it depends on your capacity to be able to do it. As a sort of a beginner, and for most people, you can probably get away with it for 30 minutes, 2 times a week. That will give you benefit. Obviously, the more conditioned you become, you may add another session in, you may split the body up to be able to perform more sessions, so on and so forth. So again, there's sort of nuances in how you go about determining that. But if you're a beginner, 2 times a week, few days in between, allow the body to recover. But if you are, and by beginner I mean you've gone through your endurance type of training, you've built into strength training, you may just do 2 times a week. Again, if you've got loftier goals of just sort of general health and fitness, then you may push that up even more. But even pro athletes, their cycling training, it ebbs and flows through the week and through the months and through the year. So again, you kind of got to go down that road to be able to understand how all that works. So yes, with regards to strength training, that's kind of how you need to think about it. And with training in general, that's how you need to think about it. The ebbs and flows, again, you wouldn't do strength training 12 months of the year. You'd cycle into it and then you'd cycle back out of it, with the other types that we're going to talk about next. And sort of training goal number 2 is what I would describe as endurance training. So these are your higher rep types of training. or essentially as we start to come out of the strength phase, you start to go into an endurance phase, because in the strength phase, it just wants to feel heavy. You don't necessarily want to be feeling the burn. When we go into endurance training, we start to feel the burn. Obviously, if the goal is hypertrophy, then there are a million and one different ways of sort of building that training. I'm not necessarily going to go down that road. I'm going to just talk about, if I describe it with strength training, how to build into strength training as an example. That's how I'm sort of going to use it. I'm not using it for hypertrophy or bodybuilding training. So this tutorial and episode isn't about that. Because again, there are other things that need to be taken into consideration with regards to that. So if we take a beginner, what you might do with regards to reps and sets is, for ease of starting out, so let's just say it's your first ever training session. As a general rule, this is what I do with people. I will do 2 sets of 8 to 12 reps, and give them lighter weights than I think they can do. Why do I do that? For the very simple reason, if it's one of their first exercise sessions ever or in a long time, the body's gonna have a response to it. So they're gonna feel some muscle soreness. So we need to take that into consideration. So basically, I start them off. I don't throw them in at the deep end. I break them in, if that makes sense. So I start off with 2 sets, 8 to 12 reps, depending on what their goals are. But it's just a way of getting them doing it, getting them understanding the techniques of how to perform the exercises. And even then, I don't throw everything on top of them in the first session. I will throw some basics in the first session and then build as the sessions go. So, for example, with a squat, in the first session, I may just focus on getting the hips and the back in the right place. Then in another session, I'll start talking about, okay, let's look at foot position and knee position in a little bit more depth. It may change how they squat, but to start with, I just want to focus on, can we get the hips and the back in the right place? Then we'll talk about, and we may even add bracing, the abdominals in there and things like that. But as a starting point, 2 sets, 8 to 12 reps. As they then start building capacity, I will add another set in. So generally in the second session, I will add a 3rd set. So they've already built up from 2 to 3. I would keep the same reps. I would aim to start at 12 because that's where I can use the lightest weight. And then basically over time, so over a 2 or 3 month period, I would build them from 12 reps to 10 reps to 8 reps, keeping it at 3 sets. And each time I go from 12 to 10 to 8, I would increase the weight a little bit. Again, just to keep challenging the body, just to build the capacity of the muscles to be able to tolerate the load, the ligaments, the tendons to tolerate the load. And if I was to ask them a question, certainly to start with, I would want maybe 1 or 2, you could even say 3 reps at the end of the sets. So if you finish the set, I'd say, okay, how many more do you think you could have done? Oh, I probably could have done 1 or 2 more, or 2 or 3 more. As a beginner, that's kind of what I'm looking for. So if you're looking, this is now for sort of fitness training. Again, it's an umbrella term, it's a broad term, but 3 sets, 12 reps or 8 to 12 reps, and aiming at sort of maybe 2 or 3 that you could finish on. Again, as you get further into it, as you build from, say, beginner to intermediate to more just sort of advanced fitness, Again, you'd still be working at that 8 to 12 rep range, but you might then be looking at, well, I could only really complete one more rep, or that was all I could do. So a more sort of advanced human body that can deal with that sort of capacity, you would do that with. So you're constantly sort of pushing. And there's nothing wrong with pushing. It's just pushing, or pushing the body to its limits. There's just a way of doing it. There is a way that puts it at more risk of injury, and there is a way that puts it at less risk of injury. You can't get rid of the risk, but you can just minimise it, or you can maximise it. Again, as someone that works with people every day, I'm trying to minimise it. So I do err on the side of caution with things, but again, as I get to know how they can do things, then we can push it a little bit more. So with regards to endurance training or fitness training, general fitness training, I start a beginner at 2 sets of 8 to 12 reps. As they sort of get out of that beginner phase, they've learnt the techniques, their body has responded initially and felt sore, I would then aim to get them to 12 reps of 3 sets. And then over the next sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 months, I would bring the sets from 12 down to 8, increasing the weight. Again, there are different ways of doing it. You can get them to 12 reps and keep them at 12 reps and just keep increasing the weight at 12 reps. So you can do that. But again, over a period of a year, that's going to become relatively tedious. So you keep ebbing and flowing. So build the weight up, bring the weight down. And then inversely sort of change the reps and sets with that. How many times would you do that a week? Well, that can be done sort of two to 4 times a week, you could say. What you would start doing then is you would start training different parts of the body. You may do one more sort of bodybuilding type session. You may do one that's slightly movement based, slightly more core based, things like that. Core training is, again, another part of it, which would be slightly different. I wouldn't necessarily do, although I do them, but I wouldn't do it with everyone. That would depend on the individual. But like a core session, which could be higher rep ranges. But again, you've got to start at the level of the individual. So that would be, you would start at obviously a low time or low reps, and then build that up, add more exercises in, because again, you can shorten them. So you can have more exercises at a shorter time, or you can have less exercises at a longer time. Again, there are so many different ways of deciding to do this. There is no right way of doing it. The only time things become right and wrong is if you've got a goal and you're choosing the wrong rep sets and exercises to get them to that goal. Because a goal may require a certain type of output. So that needs to be taken into consideration. But essentially, if it's general fitness training, you can kind of use anything. It's just knowing where your starting point is. But again, as a general rule, I would start 2 sets, 8 to 12 reps. Then once they've kind of got used to the exercises, I would then go 3 sets, starting at 12, build down into 8, increasing the weight up, and then recycle that 12 back down to 8, 12 back down to 8, so on and so forth. Each cycle, the weight goes up a little bit. So again, they're building that tolerance to it. So as a general rule, that's what I would do, but you can kind of take it any way you like. What we're going to talk about next is stability training, balance training, rehab training, that type of thing. And by stability training, what I mean, it's a kind of reactive type of training. In so much as, if you can imagine doing a hand plank as an example. So you're on your hands here, your body's in a nice straight line and your feet are touching the floor down here. What you were then asked to do is lift an arm from the floor. Now a stable body will stay in exactly the same position on one hand as it does on 2 hands. So the hips stay level, They don't weight shift from side to side. They don't rotate like that when you lift the arm up. They stay centered. The same with the shoulders. You may feel other muscles working or different parts of the body working. That's normal. But the body stays in the right place. That shows the muscles are activating or contracting at the right time. So when you lift that arm up off the floor or hand up off the floor, muscles need to contract to hold the body in place. So again, with regards to this type of training, it doesn't need to be high rep to start with, because you may only do the reps that can be done, or you may do a low amount of reps, have a break, talk about the exercise. Okay, were my hips rolling? Were my hips rotating? Were my shoulders coming out of position? And things like that, and then going back to just doing 3 or 4, 5 more reps. So in the early stages, you don't need to do lots of reps, because with regards to stability training, there is no point in, or balance training, there is no point in aiming to do 20 reps, but the first 5 are good and the next 15 aren't, because you're not developing that system. So you would get a very crisp, clean 5 reps, and then you would move up 6, 8, 10, 15, 20. But they all the time, they would be nice, clean, crisp reps. This is a similar thing when we come into a rehab style training. If we take monster walks as an example, so monster walks are where you've got your feet on the floor, so obviously I'm using my hands as my feet. You've got a band going around both feet, and then you step forward. Now this is a similar thing that we talked about with the hand plank. Now, when you step forward in a monster walk, what you want is your feet to go forward in a straight line. And then you step forward and you essentially stay on like tram lines or train tracks. But what happens with a lot of people is when they pick their foot off the floor, the foot curls in and comes back out, and then it lands. It curls back in, curls out, then it lands. Curls in, curls out, then it lands. That shows me, as the trainer, the muscles in the hip that are controlling that. Obviously, it's a very long lever. The muscles that are controlling that aren't doing their job properly. So I would obviously, after a couple of reps, once I've noticed that happening, I would stop them. I would then reinforce what I'd already said. I want you to keep your feet in a straight line. They may only be able to do that for 3 or 4 reps, then that's how many they do. And then slowly, as they build competence with it, and it builds sort of, it ingrains in the brain or in the nervous system essentially, then we start to develop the reps. Now what you could do is you could start off with a low rep and then say push an extra 2. So you get clean 6 reps. And you go, right, now I'm going to do 8. But the last 2 are keep kicking in. If it's the last 2 that are kicking in, that's not a bad thing, because you know now you're at your limit. So you can focus on those last 2 to get them right. If it was the first 2, then it would be more of a problem, because then you'd have to stick to the first 2, as I've described already. So when it comes to sort of balance, stability, rehabilitation, this is about getting the right muscles working at the right time. And certainly in rehabilitation, that is something that's very important, because we want the muscles to time properly and we want them to work in a proper sequence. So by getting sort of individual muscles working properly, what we can then start to do is integrate them into bigger movements, with the idea that they will, one, start to work properly, but more importantly, the individual will know what they need to do. So you could take that monster walk example of getting the hips to work properly and then transfer that into a squat. And how that works, now I'm starting to lean into exercise selection a little bit more, which isn't necessarily part of it, but I will describe it. Obviously, in a squat, your feet aren't coming off the floor. So there could be an argument that you can't correlate, because in monster walks, you're walking, and in a squat, you've got both feet stuck on the floor. But what I'm thinking is using the monster walks to get the hip muscles working properly. And then once I know that those hip muscles are working more effectively, when we go into, say, a squat and we drive the knees out, it's going to be much easier for the individual, because those muscles, they understand how they work. Because when they squat, their knee may drop in. And again, that's another way of doing it. Get band around someone's knees. As they squat, their knee drops in. Okay, use the band to push the band out. So that's another way of doing it. So there are lots of different ways of getting muscles to do what you want them to do. But essentially, you can train smaller muscles and then integrate them into another exercise and get them working in another exercise more effectively. Just by doing monster walks doesn't mean that they'll work properly in a squat. That's one thing that kind of gets misunderstood. If someone does, loads of one exercise, then they go, well, I can do that exercise really well, which then means I can do that exercise really well, which isn't necessarily the case. With regards to frequency and how often you should do sort of balance, stability, and rehab type exercises, if it's rehab, it depends where you are with regards to the injury. So if you're quite close to the episode of the injury and you're coming out in the initial rehab, you may do more often, but very small doses, rather than one big dose and then leave it for 3 days, because you keep getting that input, but it's not putting a huge stress on the system. If it's more stability training, you may do a bigger dose in a whole workout or a large portion of a workout, and then you may have a couple of days rest to allow everything to settle back down. And then with rehab, you would do a similar thing. Like I mentioned, you do that small dose very close. So it may be sort of lower rep, lower load or weight or whatever, lower. So it may be just one set of 6 reps, but you do 3 exercises that are sort of slightly different. And that may be it. So it takes 5-10 minutes. But you may do that every day. But as you build, and you build up to a 15-20 minute workout, you may take that from every day to every other day, and then build up to 3 times a week within a half an hour session or an hour session or a 45-minute session. So again, there's lots of sort of different ways of building it, but all the way through all of this, you're trying to build capacity in a sensible way. So with strength training, it's maintaining form all the way through, but also applying the load. With endurance training, again, it's maintaining the form, but you want to push each time to a degree of fatigue. And then with stability training, you're just looking at more so the technique of how to perform the exercise and getting the body to line up properly, which in a roundabout way is sort of showing you how the muscles are working if you know how to break exercises down or break exercises down into certain muscles. And then you've got to rebuild all of that from smaller exercises into bigger exercises, but make sure during the bigger exercises, the muscles that were working in the smaller exercises are still doing their job in the bigger exercises, because just by doing the smaller exercise doesn't mean that it's going to do it in the bigger exercise. You have to make sure all of that works. But you've built it from a solid foundation. So if we just quickly go back to the monster walks, generally with the monster walks, you'll feel the muscles of the hip working. So you know that they can work, you know what it feels like when they are working. So when you go into a squat and you perform it in a certain way, you should be able to go, yeah, I can feel my hip muscles working. Okay, good. So we've gone from that small exercise and transferred that learning into the big exercise. So that's sort of a very simple way of doing it. But with regards to stability training, it can be as low as 3 or 4 reps. It could be as low as 1 set, and then you would build up into, say, 3 sets of 20 reps or whatever, depending on the goal that you were trying to achieve from it. But then you would probably be mixing in endurance training and strength training with all of that. So then it just becomes a big mishmash of different exercises, reps, sets, so on and so forth. So hopefully that's given you a better insight into how to choose sets, reps, and how many times per week. Hopefully it's given you some examples, and hopefully you'll be able to sort of choose that for yourselves, or at least have a better idea of what exercises require what type of reps and sets. So many thanks for watching. If you've liked the content, hit the like button. If you learned something new, hit the thanks button. If you want to watch more of these, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. And if you've got a comment or a question, please do stick it down below.